Hello, and thank you for joining us for this webcast presentation on 5 terrorism trends impacting business, brought to you by Stratfor Threat Lens. Threat Lens helps global companies and security professionals identify, anticipate, measure, and mitigate risks that emerging threats pose to their people, assets, and interests around the world. I'm Adam with Stratfor. We'll welcome today's presenters in just a few moments. But first, some quick housekeeping notes. Note that we will be live streaming today's video presentation. That means video quality will vary depending on your internet connection. If you run into any problems streaming today's live webcast, first try reconnecting or refreshing your browser. Also know that a link to the recorded webcasts will be shared following the live presentation. Our Threat Lens web presentation on 5 terrorism trends impacting business will run between 45 and 60 minutes in all. We'll reserve the last half of the presentation for your questions. For those joining us for the live event, you may submit those questions at any time using the window on the right side of your browser. Once we get to the Q&A portion, our presenters will respond to as many of your questions as possible in the time we have remaining. Now I'd like to introduce our lead analysts with Stratfor Threat Lens, who will be joining us for today's presentation. Vice President of Tactical Analysis, Scott Stewart, leads Stratfor's analysis of terrorism and security issues. Before joining Stratfor, Mr. Stewart served as a special agent with the U.S. Department of State. He's been involved in hundreds of terrorism investigations, including the first World Trade Center bombing. Fred Burton is Stratfor's Chief Security Officer and one of the world's foremost authorities on security and terrorism. Mr. Burton oversees Stratfor's analysis of global security developments and consults with clients on security-related issues affecting their businesses, assets, or personal safety. During his service with the U.S. State Department, Mr. Burton was Deputy Chief of Counterterrorism with the Diplomatic Security Service. I'd like to now welcome Scott Stewart and Fred Burton to the webcast. Gentlemen.
Hi, thanks for being with us.
It's good to be with you today, Scott, for us to chat about the 5 terrorism trends impacting business. I know you and I have spent some time in this field and have discussed this in the past a great deal amongst our Threat Lens team, but I think the first thing we'd like to talk about is that competition between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Would you like to share that with our viewers, Scott, your views on that?
Well, actually, let's back up just a bit and talk a little bit about the drivers that are driving the trends, if we can. So just briefly, when we're forecasting terrorist trends, we're looking at a number of things that tend to drive terrorism. The first of those is ideology, and certainly that's what we see with this competition between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. But even before that, obviously, the development of anarchist ideology really led to terrorism. And certainly terrorism has changed over the years as we saw things like suicide terrorism come into being as ideologies grasped onto that as a tactic. So ideology is a big driver of terrorism and terrorism trends. Another is political things. Most recently, obviously, we saw with the Arab Spring and the way that it kind of drove not only terrorism throughout the Middle East, but really, helped give rise to what became the Islamic State. So political things, whether that's, a European and NATO intervention in Libya, overthrowing Gaddafi, Arab Spring, even things such as the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt really tend to drive and foster terrorism trends. Another thing that we see are attacks and responses to attacks. And they tend to kind of cause really an evolution, and we see kind of a cycle going there. Certainly we saw that with aircraft attacks, where we have seen, just different kinds of devices used and how that changes based upon what the authorities are doing. So there's kind of a cat and mouse there based upon tactics and on responses to tactics that drives terrorism trends. Another closely related to that is technology. Certainly the advent of microelectronics has helped in things like IED construction, other forms of terrorist tradecraft. So technology is a driver. And of course, related to that is media. And, media is a significant driver, and really is one of the things that gave rise to the phenomenon of terrorism was really the advent of global media and the ability to send, stories and information about attacks by wire services and into newspapers. So really, those are the trends that we're looking at, or the drivers that we're looking at. And now let's talk about some of those trends and how they impacted Fred. So you wanted to talk, first of all, about the competition between Islamic State and Al-Qaeda?
Yes, Scott, I think that this is one of the phenomena that we have been looking at very closely along with our geopolitical team. As you look at the success we're having against the Islamic State, what impact do you think that has on Al-Qaeda?
Well, we've had this struggle going on kind of for the heart and mind of the jihadist movement since the Islamic State broke away from Al-Qaeda back in 2013, 2014. I believe that struggle is going to continue, but I also think that the fracturing is not over. I really believe that we're going to see other jihadist groups and kind of factions break off. There are some people that say that they believe that the implosion of the caliphate is going to lead to a reconciliation of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and I'm very skeptical of that. If we look back at kind of the history of ideologies, whether it's Marxism, whether it's religious ideologies, even look at Christianity or Islam itself, there really is a trend towards a splintering or a fracturing of those movements rather than a coalescing. So I believe that as we move forward, as the jihadist movement matures, we're going to see more fracturing. In some ways that may be good because some of the strains may be more moderate and more political and more nationalist in orientation. But I also think that we have a possibility to see other factions that become more militant, kind of the way that we saw really, initially the Islamic State in Iraq or Al-Qaeda in Iraq become more radical than Al-Qaeda itself. So I think that we're going to see kind of, more radical splinters come out of this fighting. And I think we will also see some more moderate, but there's going to be kind of a range in between. And many of them are going to prove to be problems and prove to be deadly across the globe.
Scott, I know in looking at the second trend, which is the extreme left and right-wing violence that we're seeing, we've been writing a lot about that for Threat Lens as it impacts businesses. What do you think is the biggest threat from a corporate security perspective?
Well, there are many threats from a corporate security perspective, unfortunately, both to facilities, operations, but also to personnel. As we look at the kind of rise of nationalism, of white supremacy, and really other forms of nationalism, that really has a tendency to give rise to kind of xenophobic attacks against foreigners in various countries, and whether that's a place like Russia, whether that's even a place like India or France, it really poses a threat for minority employees of these corporations who are in these places. And so that raises a threat to our people or to corporate people as they're in those places. Of course, there is also the threat of violence directed against corporate operations and facilities. And perhaps even more dangerous than right-wing extremism in that realm is far left from the anarchists. The anarchists have proved to be very, very successful at arson attacks. And really within the last couple of weeks, we've seen a string of very destructive arson attacks in Belgium and France. And actually even today we had one in Montevideo in Uruguay. So there really is a risk of attacks to facilities from these people. Usually the anarchists are not really looking to kill people. It's more property damage. But with the capabilities they have as far as arson and sabotage, they tend to actually cause bigger losses than some of the right-wing type terrorist attacks.
I know from our following of this, which we do very closely, that we've seen somewhat of a unique trend, meaning a shift from the specific targeting, for example, of the CEO and laser fixation at times on the chief financial officers of companies, which is unusual because usually you'll find Fortune 500s with robust programs on CEOs. But that's where it stops. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that overall we have been tracking for many years here that tendency to go personal against corporate officials and not just the companies. I think that these activists have found out that they get people's attention much more when they attack or conduct a demonstration or harassment at the home of these corporate officials, rather than just doing some sort of action at the office. Most corporate CEOs these days have better security than other officers. And so it almost makes sense for these activists to kind of go farther down the chain in order to find more vulnerable targets where they can apply more pressure. In addition to going after those sorts of people, like like the CFOs, the chief financial officers, we're also seeing activists going against companies that do business with the targeted company. So they're not just going to look at the company they're targeting, but any company that does business with them, and that can include things like companies that provide supplies, companies that provide financing. So they'll go after banks. They'll go after other financial institutions that are financing things the company does. And so the target set has actually become much wider for this activist type, these activist incidents. And certainly we've seen that as far as the pipeline activism here in the U.S.
Frightening kind of shifts, and one that clearly businesses need to get in front of. Scott, let's look at our third terrorism trend, which is the online University of Jihad. And the ramifications that has to corporate America.
Yeah, when we look at overall technology and how it impacts terrorism, we've seen the internet so far been very useful for conveying propaganda and kind of recruiting new individuals. It's really I think the Islamic State has mastered that art of really kind of radicalizing and recruiting people over the internet. But so far, they've had a lot of difficulty providing terrorist tradecraft training to those people. We've seen them make efforts to do so through vehicles such as, Inspire magazine. But the things and the complexity of what they can handle or what they can pass on by Inspire is somewhat limited. As we look at new technologies today, though, we are seeing how people are able to use the internet and really indeed, conferencing, web conferencing to provide, lessons of music. My son teaches guitar online, believe it or not, to people in other cities. And they can look at each other, back and forth over webcams. He can show them how to make the chords and whatever. And that concerns me that we're going to see this happening in the terrorist realm, with perhaps, master bomb makers working with these would-be grassroots jihadists who are, really kind of clueless and helping walk them through step by step how to make a bomb. It's one thing to provide instructions in a manual, but it's another thing to have that face-to-face interaction where you can watch someone, you can see what they're doing, you can correct their mistakes and help them to do it properly. And this is very concerning to me. Of course, it's not just something of concern to jihadist terrorists. We also think that it could happen in anarchists, in the far right, in other places where expert terrorists can really help to equip these, grassroots activists who are working underneath the rubric of leaderless resistance.
Scott, let's move on to our fourth trend, the aspect of deadly cyber terrorism. What do you mean by deadly cyber terrorism?
Well, so far, mostly what we have seen, that's been called cyber terrorism, such as the activities of the cyber caliphate that's working with the Islamic State, has really been more confined to, hacking, or not even hacking, cracking somebody's password on Facebook or Twitter, and really being able to, kind of vandalize, those kind of accounts. That's not really, hacking so far. We've also seen them outing information, or what's called in, the hacker realm, doxing, providing, identifiable information or address information of cops, religious institutions, soldiers, things like that. But those have been really big lists. And it's usually information that's fairly readily available on the internet. What concerns us is that we're going to see something, very soon, where we have, these terrorists being able to cause actual damage. If you even look at the recent examples of some of the ransomware attacks, the NotPetya and some of the others that have been able to shut down hospitals and their ability to function, I think we're going to see, attacks along those lines, attacking hospitals, attacking utilities, attacking things like, traffic light systems in cities. Think about today, if someone was to change all the lights in Austin to green during rush hour, what potential impact it could have and how that could result, in injuries or death. So I think we're going to see an evolution of that sort of hacking that actually results in death and not just kind of threats or document dumps.
Yeah, very well put. And with the saber rattling in Southeast Asia and with North Korea, one has to sit back and wonder what their contingency plans are inside the North Korean regime to target those companies helping the Department of Defense or Five Eyes nations.
No, that's a great point, Fred. Plus, you have to remember the Iranians, and not just them, but their proxies. So, they could be passing. They have a fairly sophisticated hacking capability. They can be passing that sort of capability off to groups such as Hezbollah.
No doubt, and we both know how sophisticated the Iranian intelligence services are and their capabilities globally and the ability to reach out. Let's move on, Scott, to our fifth terrorism trend, which is the drone threat. What's your thoughts on the development of the drone threat as it impacts businesses?
Well, really, so far what we've seen has basically been the use of these commercial drones to drop, basically military ordnance, mostly in war zones. Obviously in Syria and Iraq, we've seen it used quite heavily. But recently, we've seen some other developments. For example, we've seen the PKK playing with drones in Turkey, but they're again using military ordnance. More recently, I thought it was interesting, just within the last 10 days or so, we actually saw an incident where a Mexican cartel was playing with a commercial drone, and they had a small kind of homemade firework, wrapped in a tinfoil ball, but just a very small IED that they were apparently looking to drop on someone in Mexico. So people are really being kind of energized by this trend. And there again, when we talk about the drivers of terrorism, both media and technology, but also past attacks drives this. And so the use of these drones in places like Iraq and Syria is generating interest among people who have access to them. I believe that the threat's going to be somewhat limited for the foreseeable future, just because of the fact that it's very difficult to get military ordnance, in the West. So, can they perhaps try to drop some sort of a small pipe bomb or other small improvised explosive device? Possibly. But I don't think it's going to be very damaging in reality. I think it's probably going to cause more panic and more disruption than it will actual damage. And that's really what we saw in Iraq and Syria with the drones Islamic State was using. They were causing really more panic and fear than actual destruction. But still, in a context in the West, Think about a sporting venue or a concert venue that could cause as many trampling deaths, perhaps more trampling deaths than deaths from the small explosive itself. Just to take a little bit of a transfer here, or a little bit of a rabbit trail, another big fear of drones is their use in surveillance. Certainly, we've seen terrorist groups use that in places like Iraq and Syria. And when we think about a context of corporate security in the U.S. or the West, think about some group using these UAVs to conduct surveillance on a corporate facility, or perhaps on the CEO's protective detail. And so this is really going to raise or provide some problems for corporate security and their need to start paying attention to these drones as they're hovering around the protective details and corporate facilities, or even the CEO's residence for that matter.
Which is a very good point, Scott. As you and I know from our past, that unless your security team or your contract guard force is looking for drones, you really don't know whether or not you've experienced a surveillance operation or not. And in essence, as you look at down the food chain, so to speak, with the C-suite, how do you know if these drones have conducted any kind of overflights of residences and so forth? So it's a real challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a nightmare, not only for privacy concerns, but obviously for, anyone conducting or planning to conduct even a criminal attack, a criminal kidnapping, much less a terrorist attack against an executive.
Well, I think at this point, we would like to turn it over to our audience.
Thank you, Scott and Fred. And thanks again to those of you joining us live. We'll get to your questions in just a moment, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Stratfor Threat Lens. Threat Lens is designed to help security professionals pinpoint which evolving global developments pose a threat to their people, assets, and interests around the world. That means giving you the tools to quickly identify which events are truly significant to your organization so you can make decisions with confidence. It also means knowing what to expect before a threat materializes on your front door. Threat Lens's multi-layered analytical framework, built upon Stratfor's geopolitical methodology, allows our analysts to evaluate both the immediate significance and future implications of emerging situations of interest. Threat Lens's annual and quarterly forecasts then provide clients the necessary intelligence so they can implement protective measures. Direct access to the Threat Lens analysts team then delivers the individualized context you need. In addition to our interactive global dashboard, the threat matrix for each country measures criminal activity, terrorism and insurgency, industrial espionage, and business continuity, as well as overall country scores. And Stratfor Threat Lens is also the only unified solution that integrates the full spectrum of issues facing security leaders, spanning threats against people, infrastructure, intellectual property, and business continuity. If you would like to learn more about how Stratfor Threat Lens can support your organization's security and business goals, you should see a link to the right side of your screen.
All right, thank you all very much. We're going to turn now to our Q&A. And for our Q&A section, due to some technical difficulties, I'm afraid only Scott Stewart is going to be available to join us. Scott, our first question, I'm looking at these 5 trends. One of our attendees asked, why not anything related to the Mexican drug cartels?
Well, this is terrorism. And I don't consider the cartels to be terrorists. They are criminals who are financially motivated. Certainly, there are a number of developments we're following with the cartels. If you can take a look at, if you're a Threat Lens client, look at our cartel forecast. We're also looking right now at doing some updates on the various I guess we call them sections of organized crime. Now, we really can't go by cartel names anymore because things have been so fractured. But we're working through a series of analyses looking at the Tamaulipas-based organized crime kind of atmosphere and trends right now. Also, as far as Tierra Caliente organizations and trends, and the Sinaloa-based trends. So it's something we follow very carefully, but we don't consider them terrorists.
Thank you, Scott. Our next question, they're asking here, anything related to malware specifically? I know we did touch on deadly cyber terrorism, but what about malware and those risks for organizations?
No, absolutely. Malware is something that is increasing in scope and size, both on the criminal side, the industrial espionage side. But I believe that's going to be one of the vehicles used by terrorist organizations more in the future, especially if you have organizations that are linked to state sponsors such as Iran or North Korea. That increases the possibility even more. But with the off-the-shelf stuff now that can be purchased, really on the dark net, any organization, terrorist or criminal, has the capability to buy this off-the-shelf malware and use it in phishing or spear phishing attacks against corporations. Beyond that, one of the things that has concerned me for a long time is the insider threat, but that's something that we'll talk about another day. But certainly the threat of organizations or criminals or even intelligence agencies recruiting business insiders to help them inject malware or steal information.
Thank you very much, Scott. We have another question coming up looking at video training. So the online University of Jihad. It says, with all this video training, is this really a danger or is it an opportunity to track people?
I think there is a little bit of both, and I would hope that governments are keying up for that. The problem is, however, with the combination of end-to-end encryption and the dark web and tools such as Tor, I think it's going to be a challenge to hone on and really focus on specific accounts of people who are providing the training, and then identifying the people that they're talking to in the West and elsewhere. Certainly one of the things that we're hoping to do as we kind of talk about this and publicize this is get people to focus on the problem, whether it's in private industry or in the government. But we believe it is going to be a problem just because of these increases, in encryption and really in kind of the dark places that exist now that the governments just don't have purview into due to encryption.
Thank you, Scott. Another question, they note that Amazon and some other companies have started to use drones in their businesses. In the mid and long term, how can terrorism or what we're seeing now impact drone-run businesses like that?
Well, certainly there's a cyber threat of them being able to kind of commandeer some of those drones, especially if they're the more very expensive, heavier drones that can take larger payloads. But certainly even think about how today even we see terrorist clone vehicles. Whether that's trying to, clone or things like we're seeing in Somalia or Iraq and Syria, where they try to, disguise a vehicle to look like a government vehicle in order to do an attack. Certainly you could do the same thing with corporate drones. Have something that looks like an Amazon drone, but instead of delivering whatever widget it is that you've ordered, it's bringing a 5-pound bomb to your home. Things like that are quite terrifying, for everyone across the spectrum. And certainly there's going to have to be ways developed to be able to find those kinds of bad drones amid all the other drone traffic as things begin to pick up.
Our next question up here. They say European authorities seem to be doing a good job wrapping up terrorist group as they plan attacks. How do you see these groups changing their tactics in response? The old MO of renting an apartment and cooking up a device is too easily impacted or interceded by law enforcement. So what's next?
Well, we've already seen what's next. And that's really the simple tactics that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula began promulgating, back in 2010, 2009. These simple attacks: use a knife, use a rock, use a truck. anything that kind of condenses the weapons acquisition and creation portion of the terrorist attack cycle. And even going as they have to this leaderless resistance model is also intended to help, camouflage those preparations and make it more difficult for the authorities to pick up on. So they are making those steps and taking those steps, but fortunately, the governments have been responding well. Another part of that, too, by the way, is just people. And whether that's clerks at stores or whether that's neighbors reporting suspicious behavior, people within the communities, mosques and such reporting hotheads or people that are talking about violence. All those things help the authorities to be able to get ahead of those people as they are planning bad things in their terrorist attack cycle.
All right. Our other listener asked, do you think the terrorist threat to civil aviation has rescinded?
Not at all. I think by all indications, we continue to see that a wide variety of terrorist groups are still interested in attacking aviation. We keep hearing of plots from Al-Qaeda-linked groups, such as Al-Shabaab recently in Somalia with, the laptop bombs. We've had some plots allegedly involving the Islamic State, and it appears that they destroyed a Russian airliner in the Sinai a couple years ago. So it seems like at least both poles of the jihadist realm are interested in aviation targets, and I just don't see that letting up anytime soon. Any sort of threat or attack against an airliner or even against a cargo aircraft generates a lot of publicity and a lot of attention. And that is one of the reasons that they have historically been such popular, targets, for these terrorists. Some of the attacks are, less skillful. I mean, the one this year in Australia where they had the components shipped, from Turkey to Australia to put in that meat grinder device seemed a little bit ham-fisted. But I think that if someone with a little bit more operational acumen was able to work on that same plot, they may have had a little bit more success. So I am concerned about that kind of, I guess Paul Cruikshank called it the IKEA approach to terrorism. And there is concern about that as well. These people coordinating and sending devices and more sophisticated devices to people overseas to put together.
Thank you. Michael notes that counter-drone techniques are being hamstrung, at least in North America, by FAA and FCC regulations. Do you see relief in this area, or are we going to have to wait until it's too late?
That's a great question. Sadly, if we look at our history, usually it seems like it takes a disaster in order to spark any sort of significant change. I pray that that's not the case here with drones, and I hope that people can understand this threat and enact some common sense protections, for individuals and corporations before it's too late. But yes, it does seem that there has been some resistance to that, and I hope that the cooler heads will prevail and that things can be approved before it's too late.
One question regarding to the competition or the conversation about the competition between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. In which regions are splinter groups most likely to develop? And they say they're guessing North Africa, the Sahel, and Southeast Asia. Are there many others?
Well, yeah, I think we're really watching for that in Yemen as well. So really across the spectrum. Certainly, in Nigeria right now, we have two organizations claiming to be the Islamic State. Only one is officially recognized. And interestingly enough, there, the group that's officially recognized, the Al-Barnawi section of Islamic State West Africa, they actually have a targeting ideology and target set that's actually closer to Al-Qaeda than that of the Islamic State. So it really does seem like there's some possibility there for kind of a realignment, further splintering. But really, I think across the realm, there's a possibility for some of these groups, especially once Baghdadi's killed, because most of the basically the proclamations of loyalty that they give, the bayat, is to a person, actually, not an organization. So once al-Baghdadi is vaporized, I believe that we're going to see, some realignment there. But I don't think it's going to be a wholesale realignment to al-Qaeda. I think we're going to see some groups kind of go more independent, and perhaps some of them will even get more radical than what we're seeing the Islamic State do.
Thank you. Another question: what are your feelings on arena and stadium threats in North America? I think this clearly referencing the recent mass shooting in Las Vegas.
Well, that as well as the drone threat as well. I know it really is scary right now. And when we talk about past attacks and the media driving terrorism trends, there's a heavy element of copycatism there. And that's what concerns me right now. By all accounts, it doesn't appear that the Las Vegas shooter was aligned with the Islamic State, despite the fact that the group claimed it. But I am concerned that we are going to see jihadists attempt to replicate that kind of an attack at other stadiums elsewhere, whether that's in North America or other parts of the world. So it really is a very big concern right now. And certainly there's been a concerted effort to hit those sorts of targets. Not only have we seen, the Bataclan attack against the concert there during Paris. We had the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. We had the attempt in Garland, Texas at the cartoon thing. We actually had a music festival in Germany that a suicide bomber tried to hit. So there have been the Ariana Grande attack in Manchester, United Kingdom. So there's been really a focus on those sorts of targets. Another one, the Paris attacks that tried to get into the soccer game, by the way, also. So there's been a number of attempts to get at those sorts of targets. I believe that's going to continue to be a popular target set just because of the fact that you have so many people gathered together in that sort of vulnerable place. And even, just over the last week, we saw the Islamic State again repeat their threats against the World Cup in Russia that's coming up this next summer. So certainly it's on everybody's radar, and whether it's an organized group or a grassroots jihadist, I believe we're going to see attempts continue to hit those sorts of targets.
Jennifer asked, looking at the drone threat conversation, are you saying that we're going to have anti-droneware in a similar way that we have antivirusware for computers to find bad drones?
Yeah, I believe that there is. I mean, whether it's drones having to go to some sort of a IFF, identify friend or foe type system to kind of broadcast who they are and what they're doing. There may be some sort of a system like that is needed as our skies get more clouded or congested with these drones, just to keep track of what's what and who's who. And there are a number of companies right now that are looking at different types of technologies to counter UAVs. When I was at the ASIS conference last month in Dallas, there are all these companies. Some of them are looking at kind of directed energy type weapons. Other ones are looking at nets. So you kind of have friendly drones that are going out and capturing enemy drones. Other companies are even using eagles and birds of prey to snatch drones out of the air. So we're seeing a lot of people understanding that this is an emerging threat. It is an emerging problem. And obviously we need to have measures put in place to counter hostile drones.
Our next question, looking back at the attack in Las Vegas, they note that Police One is reviewing that shooting and made the point that those hosting events will have to factor in possible counter sniper teams. Do you see something similar to that as far as drone threats for events?
I think that we're going to see it get to that point where you're going to need some sort of basically like radar coverage at a low altitude to cover these events so that you know if there is a hostile drone coming into the area. And certainly it does appear, especially with the advent of these stadiums now that we're seeing that, I'm thinking of the one in Atlanta, for example, where you have kind of this premium hotel, kind of part of the complex, of the sports stadium and event stadium. So I think that as we see those sorts of, things continue to develop, countermeasures are going to have to be put in place to try to, mitigate or stop those sorts of attacks, whether that means, special glass or glass coatings in those buildings overlooking those events, whether it means, counter sniper teams. And obviously it's going to mean a lot of different things for counter sniper teams. In the past, counter sniper teams have basically focused their efforts on, building rooftops, but also buildings that have windows that could open. But now that we've seen somebody smash them with a sledgehammer, non-opening windows, counter sniper teams are also going to have to adjust how they work in response to that tactic.
Thank you. Our next question, and we just have time for a few more. What is there to learn from threat mitigation and risk management plans for hotel security and tourist management? And they note lessons that they can learn from the recent bombings in Somalia.
Oh my, yeah. Well, obviously Somalia is kind of a unique case right now, and they've been able to, get home with some very big bombs. And fortunately, that's not the case elsewhere. And really in many places, we've seen, the security measures put in place, help prevent those sorts of bombings or really mitigate the impact. I'm thinking back to the big one against the Marriott in Islamabad, or we also had the Pearl Continental in Peshawar several years ago. So in a lot of those high threat type environments, people are understanding that you need a wide perimeter. You need to have physical barriers in place to stop those truck bombs from coming in place. But certainly, aside from the hotels themselves, corporate security departments need to really work on continuing to educate their people, trying to encourage their people to stay at or in hotel rooms that face away from the main entrance or the road, looking for places that are less vulnerable to large vehicle bomb attacks. So there's a lot of aspects of that threat, but certainly it's something that can be worked on, and that we all do need to continue to work on.
Thank you. Our last question. In terms of cyberterrorism, is there any evidence you've seen of terrorist groups or other extremists hacking autonomous vehicles or seeking to develop that capability?
I personally have not seen anything to do with that, but it would not surprise me. Certainly, there's been a lot of hacker talk about not just autonomous vehicles, but non-autonomous vehicles that are linked to the internet. I was at a cyber security conference about a year ago in Berlin, and one of the presenters there was a hacker who was doing all kinds of crazy things with these BMW cars, as far as being able to basically control them, control their braking, control their acceleration, other things that were hooked into the car's computer. And that's pretty scary. And certainly it does seem like these autonomous vehicles, where you don't have a driver in there to try to counter whatever the hacker or the person grabbing control of the vehicle, it does seem like that would even be more vulnerable. And certainly these companies that are developing these systems have to be aware of the threat and have to be trying to implement protections against them, just as the regular automobile producers now are trying to scramble to make sure that their systems are patched against these sorts of hack attacks.
And that's all the time we have for today's live webcast. I'd like to thank Vice President of Tactical Analysis, Scott Stewart, and Chief Security Officer, Fred, with Stratfor Threat Lens, for taking the time to share their insights on 5 terrorism trends impacting business. In case you missed any part of today's presentation or would like to go back and review, we will share a link to the recording. And thank you once again for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about Stratfor Threat Lens and how it can support your organization's effort to mitigate risks that emerging threats pose to your people, assets and interests around the world, visit us at stratfor.com. Take care and be well.